Jason Greenblatt is a former White House envoy to the Middle East and a former special representative for international negotiations. Good evening to you, Jason.
Hello, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Really good to have you with us. Anthony Blinken, pretty blunt speaking there, saying that the toll of civilians, especially women and children, in Gaza is far too high. Um, uh, do you expect language as blunt as that from a US Secretary of State speaking in Israel?
Look, his remarks were good, in particular with respect to South Africa, in particular with respect to how Hamas embeds itself in the civilian population. But to point out that the civilian death toll is too high without providing a solution to what Israel is fighting is not particularly helpful. So Hamas, as we all know, does embed itself in the civilian population, and moreover, instead of spending money on bomb shelters and ways to keep the Palestinian population safe, just use their money to cause war, to have terror tunnels. So I understand what he's saying, and of course, everybody feels the tragic loss of innocent life, but there is no solution when you have a threat like Hamas, who harms Palestinians and Israelis.
You've got, though, more than 23,000 people, most of them women and children, killed in Gaza. Although, of course, we do have to remember that these are figures from the health ministry, which is run by Hamas. But isn't that, in some ways, a statement of the obvious that the death toll in Gaza now is far too high?
Well, first of all, and you're correct in pointing out it's Hamas figures. Second of all, are these people who were forced to stay where they died because Hamas forced them to do so? There's a lot of reporting on that. But the real question again is, what is Israel, what is any country supposed to do in a situation like this? Stand down and let themselves be attacked, or try as best as they can to avoid civilian deaths, which Israel does time and again. And yet the tragedy of war is that innocent lives are lost. It's a good look, you're making a good point, but at the same time, when you follow the logic through, I think Israel has no choice but to do what it's doing.
What do you make of the current state of relations between the US and Israel? As we heard there, Antony Blinken again stressing that the US still supports Israel. But it seems pretty clear that there's quite a bit of tension between the two now. We are hearing that Antony Blinken was bringing that message of more restraint needed, one that perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu is simply not prepared to comply with at the moment.
I think there is tension. The situation is extremely tense. I do still think that the Biden administration is standing by Israel, and I think Secretary of State Blinken's comments show that. I think that the best thing that the United States could do is send our defense secretary, who of course right now is not in a place to do this, but send the types of people who could actually give meaningful advice to Israel. A secretary of state is not a military person. So having him go there and make these kinds of comments is unhelpful. But I do think that the Biden administration remains committed to Israel's safety. I think they need to do more on the Iranian regime. They need to do more with the Houthis. But generally speaking, I think they're trying their best in this tense time to retain that relationship.
You're referring, when you talk about the defense secretary there, to Lloyd Austin, who has apparently been ill, and people only found out about it after he'd been missing for a few days. But is there a wider problem here? Because as we know, Benjamin Netanyahu is under a lot of domestic pressure. He's also facing corruption charges. In a sense, it suits him to keep this war going, doesn't it? Because as soon as the war is over, or has at least gone beyond the peak point, those questions about his responsibility for what happened on October the 7th, his conduct in this war, and what happens next will start crowding in, won't they?
I don't believe that line of thinking at all. One day that will come to pass, regardless of whether he likes it or not, but I do not believe he's cynically prolonging the war. I think he's doing his job, which is to protect the people in the nation of Israel. And I don't subscribe to that type of conjecture.
What about the actions which Israel apparently has taken beyond Israel's borders and beyond Gaza, the action against Hezbollah leaders and against a Hamas leader in Lebanon. What is the United States approach to that? Because we are seeing those real concerns emerging of an escalation of the conflict.
Well, the U.S. is trying very hard to avoid metastasizing this war, but Israel understands, and we all have to face the music that Hezbollah is an even worse threat than Hamas. And one way or the other, Israel's going to have to figure out how to deal with Hezbollah. Israel's made it clear that they're going to go after anybody who has caused October 7th or threatens Israel, and I think they mean what they say.
So, do you think that the United States is prepared to simply accept that Israel will have to take some sort of action against Hezbollah in Lebanon, even though Hezbollah is a much more powerful force than Hamas? And indeed, that could mean spreading the conflict, which is something that America wants to avoid.
Certainly, America wants to avoid it, but I don't think Israel really will have a choice. I don't know that Israel's ready to do it either. I think the Biden administration's approach, and here I terribly disagree with the Biden administration, is that they could solve these problems through diplomacy, both with Hezbollah and the Houthis. You can't solve problems with Hezbollah and the Houthis or Hamas through diplomacy. So I definitely strongly disagree with that approach. And I think Israel will have to, I'm sure they're already thinking about how to deal with Hezbollah. And the world has to understand that when you have a terrorist regime like Hezbollah on the other side of your border, remember, thousands and thousands of people now can't even live in northern Israel because of this threat. I was in a hotel in Jerusalem last week. 85, 90% of the hotel was filled with Israeli refugees who can't live in their homes. How do you keep a country going like that?
Where do you think, though, that this conflict goes next? And I mean, the difficulty is that no one seems to have any solution beyond a two-state solution, but that doesn't seem to be even anywhere near any kind of talks at the moment. There does seem to be a sense in Israel that Benjamin Netanyahu feels that he'll need to control, at very least, the security right across Gaza. But who then runs Gaza after this?
Nobody has the answer to that yet. I mean, my hope, and if I was still in the White House, is I'd be encouraging the American Arab allies together with Israel, as well, in particular, Egypt and the Gulf states, to work with Israel to help Palestinians with their lives, rebuilding their lives in Gaza, keeping the security, easing tension. But as far as any form of peace agreement, whether you use the phrase two state solution or not, I don't like the terminology. I think we're a long way off from anything like that happening unless and until there's new Palestinian leadership, both in Gaza and in the West Bank.
But it's impossible to see that at the moment, isn't there? I mean, Gaza is a place where, as we were hearing, more than 20,000 people have been killed, thousands have been displaced from their homes, millions are dependent on food aid. There is a real problem of hunger, and it's very difficult to see how, out of all of that and the scale of the destruction, you can get some kind of moderate Palestinian leadership that is prepared to even enter into negotiations with Israel.
I think that's true, though there are many young voices who are thirsting to change the leadership. They don't have the power to do it. They're afraid to do it. Most of them are afraid to speak out loud. And unless and until they can do it, you're right. We are very far away from that. This is, of course, one tragic story of the Middle East. There are others: Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. It's a rough neighborhood, and we have to recognize that reality, no matter how badly we feel for the Palestinians who are suffering in Gaza right now because of their leadership.
Yeah, let me just ask about, you mentioned Yemen. We've had this very explicit threat from the US and the UK and a number of other nations to the Houthi rebels in Yemen that they could face military action if they don't stop attacking international shipping. Do you think that the US is really prepared to carry out that threat, that it is prepared to enter into military action if we see further attacks?
Well, if they're not prepared, that's going to be terrible, not just for the United States, but for most of the world. If we can't stand up to that type of aggression, and if we want to just look the other way, we could be prepared for a lot more bad activity coming out of the Houthis. I don't think we have a choice but to show we mean business. And hopefully, our allies, including the United Kingdom, will work with us to make sure to keep those areas safe.
Just finally, of course, we're into a US presidential election year. If, as seems at least quite likely, Donald Trump, for all his legal difficulties, does emerge as the next president, do you think there would be a change in any way of foreign policy towards this area of the world, towards the Middle East?
Well, he has one doctrine, which is he doesn't like getting involved in foreign wars and entangled into certainly long wars. On the other hand, he's not only tough, he also means what he says. And I think he would take a stronger approach. He knows when diplomacy is useless. I think in this case, he would probably feel like diplomacy is useless and take some sort of action in order to keep everything safe. It's just, we have to recognize that you can't deal with Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah the way you would, a recalcitrant country who's doing something wrong. These guys just want to destroy everything. They want to burn the house down.
Jason Greenblatt, former White House envoy to the Middle East. Really good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.